When a police officer asked a strange woman to step out of her car in the middle of the night, he thought he was exercising authority as usual. He didn't know he had just pulled over a lieutenant colonel in the United States Army. What happened next wasn't an argument, but a lesson in discipline, dignity, and justice from a woman who didn't need to raise her voice to be heard. Sometimes, the greatest strength doesn't come from shouting, but from unwavering silence. And a camera turned on at just the right moment can make an entire system reflect on itself. It was late at night on the deserted streets of Lexington, Kentucky. Pale yellow streetlights cast a glow on the thin mist settling over the asphalt. The city was asleep, with only the occasional sound of tires gliding through the darkness. Inside an unmarked black SUV, Lieutenant Colonel Catherine Kate Morrison was driving home after a long meeting at Fort Campbell the base, where she oversaw logistics and personnel operations. Kate wasn't in uniform. She still wore her military digital watch, but her dark jeans and gray jacket made her blend in with ordinary civilians. She wasn't speeding, hadn't run any red lights. Her hands rested lightly on the steering wheel, eyes focused on the road, mind already drifting toward a cup of hot tea in the armchair by the fireplace. But then, in the rearview mirror, red and blue lights flashed. A patrol car briefly sounded its siren. She frowned and glanced at her speedometer, still within the limit. No visible reason for a stop. Still, instinct and discipline were second nature. She turned on the interior light, slowly pulled over, rolled the window halfway down, and placed both hands visibly on the wheel, clear and calm. The slam of the patrol car's door cut through the night. Footsteps approached purposefully from behind. In her side mirror, Kate saw a tall man with a flashlight in his left hand and his right hand resting near his holster. He didn't circle around to the passenger side, he came straight to her window. "License and registration," he said curtly without greeting. Kate didn't react immediately. "Officer, may I ask why I've been pulled over?" The flashlight beam shone directly into her face. "You were weaving between lanes, showing signs of being under the influence." Kate raised an eyebrow slightly. "I haven't used any substances." "License," he repeated more forcefully. Without argument, Kate slowly opened the glove compartment, retrieved her license and registration, and handed them over. She added, evenly, "This is a government vehicle. I'm a federal officer returning from base." Sergeant Brad Connors glanced at the documents. No expression except for a slight smirk. "You're military?" "That's right," Kate replied. "Still doesn't exempt you from traffic laws," he said, a mocking smile flickering across his face. "Step out of the vehicle. I need to run a sobriety test." Kate stiffened slightly. This wasn't standard protocol for someone fully cooperative, showing no signs of impairment. "On what grounds, officer?" she asked, voice steady. "I've complied. I haven't used alcohol or drugs, and I wasn't speeding." Connors stepped closer, right up to her door. "You refusing to comply?" "Number, I'm asking for an explanation." He didn't answer. Instead, he reached for her door handle in action that made Kate decide. She quietly pulled out her phone, activated the camera, and said clearly, "I'm recording this interaction for transparency and protection for both parties." Connor's eyes flickered briefly. For the first time since exiting his vehicle, his absolute confidence seemed to falter. But then he clenched his jaw and ordered, "Step out now." Kate stepped out. Her posture was upright, shoulders steady, not confrontational, but clearly not intimidated. Under the dim streetlight, she looked like an ordinary middle-aged woman. But something in her stance, in her gaze, made it impossible to dismiss her. Connors instructed her to perform a straight-line walk test. Kate walked deliberately on the sidewalk, no swaying, no missteps, as if conducting a winter drill. The result? Flawless. Still, he pulled out his pen and wrote her a citation. Failure to maintain lane. Kate didn't react. She took the paper, glanced at it, then returned to her car. Before closing the door, she spoke quietly, not to Connors, but almost to herself. "I know what I have to do." The vehicle rolled back into the darkness. But this time, Kate's mind was no longer on tea or her familiar armchair. She had just been disrespected, not for a violation, but for who she was, or rather, who someone assumed she was. And that man had picked the wrong woman. Sergeant Brad Connors was no rookie. 17 years on the Lexington Police Department's patrol line had forged in him a hardened demeanor, a gruff personality, and an unshakable belief that the badge on his chest was a permanent license to power. New recruits often whispered among themselves, "Don't get on Connor's radar. Once he locks onto you, whatever you do will be wrong." Brad Connors liked that. He liked the way people backed off when he entered a room, the way his footsteps silenced entire hallways. To him, respect was synonymous with fear. The next morning, Connors arrived at the station as usual. He swung by the break room, grabbed a pre-made cup of coffee, and sat down at his familiar workstation. He began typing up the incident report from the night before, fingers gliding across the keyboard as if drafting a routine summary. Vehicle stop at 2047 due to suspected lane weaving. Subject showed inconsistent cooperation. Field sobriety test conducted. No alcohol detected. No arrest. Citation issued. Not a single line mentioned the woman recording the interaction. No mention of him opening her car door without proper cause, and certainly no detail indicating the woman was a member of the military. Later, in the break room during a snack, Connors saw Officer DeLay, a younger cop, sitting at the table. He was chewing on a sandwich while recounting. With a boastful tone, "She thought flashing a federal ID would scare me. Just a woman. Seems like she used to be in the military or something. Spoke like she outranked me or whatever. I had her walk a straight line like in those driver's ed videos, didn't miss a step. But hey, everyone's got to follow the rules." Dale raised an eyebrow slightly. "She was military for real?" Connors scoffed. "That's what she said. Handed over some paperwork. I didn't really read it. Morrison, something like that. M." The moment that name left Connors' lips, a voice spoke up from behind. "Wait, what did you say her name was?" It was Officer Olivia Trent, someone who had served in the Army Reserves. She set her coffee mug down and stared at Connors intently. "You said Morrison? Catherine Morrison?" Connors paused. "Could be. Why?" Trent tilted her head, narrowing her eyes as if scanning her memory. "Catherine Kate Morrison is a lieutenant colonel, in charge of logistics at Fort Campbell. She ran the aid route during the Louisiana hurricane. I met her at a command leadership seminar last year, very by the book. Highly respected." The air in the room shifted. Dale slowly set his sandwich down on the plate. Connors curled his lip, trying to appear unfazed. "I don't care who she is. In Lexington, when I flash my lights, people pull over. End of story. She could be a general and still has to obey traffic laws." But Olivia Trent wasn't impressed by the statement. She said nothing more, simply turned away, but her silence carried more weight than any rebuke. Brad Connors still didn't feel concerned. To him, this was just another traffic stop among thousands he'd performed. How many people had complained? How many had been yelled at or humiliated by him on the street? And then what? All forgotten. The system protected him. Internal affairs never made a fuss. The police union always had his back. But this time wasn't like the others. Because that very morning, at Fort Campbell, Lieutenant Colonel Catherine Morrison had sent the recorded video of the incident to the office of the Inspector General at the Department of Defense. She included no accusations. She didn't write an angry letter. She simply sent the footage, a copy of the citation, and a brief incident report. Then, she called JAG, the military's legal office, and she stayed silent, not out of fear, but because she understood the process better than anyone. She didn't need to raise her voice, because truth had a voice loud enough on its own. 3 days later, a thin envelope stamped with priority mail landed in the internal mailbox of the Lexington Police Department. On the front, it read, "Request for internal records. Incident involving Lieutenant Colonel Catherine Morrison. Sent by Office of Internal Investigations, U.S. Department of Justice." That morning, Brad Connors was making coffee when he was summoned to the captain's office. Captain Foster, a gray-haired man, didn't look at Connors when he spoke. "We have something we need to discuss." Connors sat down, legs crossed, voice casual. "What's going on, sir?" Foster slid the envelope toward him. "Do you know who the woman you stopped last week is?" Connors glanced at it. "Some arrogant woman. Made all kinds of demands. I followed protocol." Foster looked up, his eyes heavy. "She's a lieutenant colonel. Decorated. Highly regarded in the military. And she's filed a formal complaint, supported by video evidence from both her phone and your body cam." Silence. Connors clenched his fists. For a brief moment, the badge on his chest no longer felt like solid ground. Sergeant Brad Connors stood at the doorway of the captain's office, eyes fixed on the envelope bearing the red seal of the Department of Justice. Part of him wanted to brush it all aside, just as he'd done countless times over the past decade. But this time, the name on the envelope wasn't a stranger. It was Lieutenant Colonel Catherine Morrison, the woman he had once forced to walk a straight line under streetlight and issued an unfounded citation. And now, that incident was being investigated at the federal level. Captain Foster wasn't the type to be easily rattled. But this time, his voice carried a clear weight of seriousness. "Connors," he said, "she's not just some service member. She holds real authority, a respected commander. And she didn't go public. No media, no internet fuss. She simply filed a complaint with video, full documentation, and all through proper channels." "So what?" Connors tried to keep his tone even. "I was doing my duty. She got pulled over for erratic movement." "That's what you wrote in the report," Foster said sharply. "But the footage from both your body cam and her personal recording shows otherwise. No erratic driving, no signs of intoxication, no resistance. Just a calm, respectful woman being treated like a criminal." Connors clenched his jaw. Foster met his eyes. "You didn't see it, did you? She didn't need to yell, didn't need to argue, just pressed record. And now the entire incident is under review by both the Department of Defense and the Department of Justice." "We'll respond," Connors said bluntly. "I have the right to defend myself." Foster leaned back, voice lower. "You'll get legal support, yes. But this time, Connors, I'm not sure responding will be enough." Meanwhile, at Fort Campbell, Lieutenant Colonel Catherine Morrison sat in her office, her expression as composed as ever. The room was minimalist. A bookshelf, a few framed medals, and a desk that was always neat. On her computer screen, a reply from the Inspector General's office had just arrived, confirming her complaint had been received and was under formal investigation. She didn't smile, didn't exhale in relief. Instead, she quietly took a sip of coffee, then gently moved her hand across the keyboard to open the video once more. The clip began. Dim lighting, the brief wail of a siren in the night. Connor's face illuminated under the flashlight, his voice cold, arrogant, impatient. Each question repeated with no purpose other than intimidation. Catherine watched it all without skipping. At the end, when she received the citation and drove off in silence, she nodded slightly. She hadn't overreacted, hadn't used her rank to overpower, hadn't gotten angry, but she also hadn't stayed silent like so many times in the past. She had chosen to record, chosen to stand not just for herself, but for those who would come after. The first person Catherine informed was her trusted deputy, Captain Sam Duvall, head of administration. "We won't make noise," she said as they met in a small conference room, "but I will proceed by the book." Sam frowned. "Are you sure about this? Once this reaches court, it won't be a small matter. You're the commanding officer here. All eyes will be on you." "I know," Catherine replied. "And I'm not doing this out of anger. I'm doing it out of principle." She paused, then said slowly, "It's not that he didn't realize I was a lieutenant colonel that upset me. It's that he never thought he needed to know." 3 days later, another envelope reached Connors this time from the Fayette County Civil Court. Inside was a court summons, with the plaintiff clearly listed, Lieutenant Colonel Catherine Morrison. Charges: violation of constitutional rights, unlawful detainment, and abuse of authority while acting in an official capacity. Connors held the paper, standing motionless in the parking lot after his shift. The evening wind slipped through the thick layer of his jacket, but it couldn't chase away the chill along his spine. He laughed a dry, brittle sound, clinging to a shred of pride. "This isn't going anywhere," he muttered. "It was just a traffic stop." But when he returned to the station, the atmosphere had changed. No one greeted him like they usually did. Younger officers avoided his gaze. In the break room, conversations stopped the moment he entered. No one said anything outright, but he could feel it. The shell around him was starting to crack. No one needed to say, "You're in trouble." The silence said it all. On the day the trial began, there was no rain, no sun, just a gray, silent sky hovering above the Fayette County Civil Court. Inside, the courtroom was small but packed. No reporters, no cameras. But every bench was filled with people from within the system. A few of Catherine's colleagues from Fort Campbell, some veterans, and several young officers from the Lexington Police Department. They made no noise. No one spoke. but their presence was a clear sign that this case was about more than a traffic ticket. The doors opened. Catherine entered wearing formal military uniform, adorned with a row of glistening medals across her chest, the silver oak leaves of a lieutenant colonel catching the ceiling lights on her epaulettes. She did not lower her head, nor did she appear overly stern. She was simply steady. As she walked past the defendant's bench, her eyes briefly met Brad Connor's. His face no longer bore its usual mocking smirk. In that moment, for the first time, the arrogance faded before the calm authority of a woman who didn't need to shout to be heard. The court called the case. Morrison v. Connors. Catherine's attorney, Delaney Price, a woman in her early 40s, with a firm but measured voice arose to begin her opening statement. Your Honor, this is not a case about a traffic citation. It's a case about how someone in uniform was dismissed and threatened not because she hid who she was, but because the other person never thought to ask. Then Delaney called the first witness, Lieutenant Colonel Catherine Morrison. Kate stood and walked to the witness stand. Her steps weren't meant to impress, yet the room fell into absolute silence. Lieutenant Colonel, Delaney began, please describe the events of that night. Around 8:45 that evening, Catherine began. I was driving a government vehicle back to Fort Campbell after a meeting with command. I was pulled over by a police car. I complied, asked why I had been stopped, and was told there were signs of lane weaving, which was not true. I presented my documents, clearly stated that I was a federal officer and the vehicle was government-owned. Nonetheless, Officer Connors ordered me out of the car without a clear explanation. Did you comply? Delaney asked. Yes, but before that, I turned on my phone and began recording. I needed precise documentation in case the situation escalated. Did you resist, threaten, or refuse any commands? No, Your Honor. Delaney nodded. We'd like to present the video. The courtroom watched intently as the footage played. Connor's voice echoed from the speakers. Curt, disrespectful, more commanding than communicative. His face, visible on body cam, showed irritation even as Catherine stood calmly, both hands visible. The screen showed Catherine walking along the sidewalk as instructed by Connors, not a single misstep, no wobble, no hesitation. Then, Connors coldly writing the citation without an apology, without explanation. When the video ended, silence settled over the room. Not boredom but a kind of awakening. Connor's attorney, Mr. Chester Brand, an older man with a neutral expression, stood for cross-examination. Lieutenant Colonel, with all due respect, he said, is it possible Officer Connors was simply following protocol, perhaps exercising caution? Caution is not the same as intimidation, Catherine replied. I showed no unusual behavior, refused no request, but his conduct made it clear he did not see a citizen. He saw someone who needed to be put in her place. Brand raised an eyebrow. You recorded because you feared unfair treatment? I recorded, Catherine said, because I've lived long enough to know silence is not protection. The courtroom stirred slightly. A few heads nodded. Then it was Connor's turn to take the stand. He wore a gray suit, trying to maintain composure. But when the video played a second time this time, under prosecution scrutiny, detail by detail, frame by frame sweat began to bead along his temples. Sergeant Connors, the prosecutor asked, why did you ask her to step out of the vehicle? Because she was asking too many questions. Are questions illégales? No, but she seemed uncooperative. Did she refuse any command? No. Did you know she was Lieutenant Colonel Morrison? No, not at the time. If you had known? Connors was silent. After a long pause, he said quietly, I probably would have acted differently. That sentence dropped like a heavy stone in the courtroom. Not because it was cruel, but because it confirmed everything Catherine had claimed. That how people treat you changes, not based on your actions, but on who they think you are. The court recessed for the jury to deliberate. As Catherine stepped down from the witness stand, she didn't look at Connors. She didn't look at the crowd either. She simply returned to her seat beside attorney Delaney Price, who leaned in and whispered, You did the right thing. Catherine nodded. Not to appear strong, but because it was the right thing to do. 3 days after the trial, the Fayette County Courthouse was much quieter. No more benches packed with soldiers and police. No more heavy stares or taut nerves like tightened strings. Today, only a small group sat silently. Lieutenant Colonel Catherine Morrison, and attorney Delaney Price, along with a few close colleagues from Fort Campbell. Brad Connors was also present. He sat still, hands clasped, eyes blank as if all his pride had been left behind in the last courtroom session. His gray suit, neatly pressed, no longer projected authority but only served to highlight the tension on every line of his face. Judge Louisa Brennan entered the courtroom and placed a thin file on the bench. She looked down, her voice steady but heavy. In the case of Morrison v. Connors, the jury has reached a verdict. The room held its breath. The court finds in favor of the plaintiff. It is determined that Sergeant Connors violated Lieutenant Colonel Morrison's constitutional rights, including unlawful detainment, abuse of authority, and failure to follow professional conduct protocol. There was no applause, no cheers of celebration, only the silence of justice properly served. Judge Brennan continued, Lieutenant Colonel Morrison will be awarded $35,000 from the Civil Legal Relief Fund. Furthermore, the case file will be submitted to the Department of Justice and the Lexington Police Department for internal review, training policy evaluation, and potential disciplinary measures. Connors lowered his head. His attorney whispered something about the possibility of an appeal, but even those words lacked conviction. Catherine didn't look at the defendant's side. She simply nodded like someone who had completed a duty, not someone celebrating a victory. After the session, outside on the courthouse steps, a few local reporters waited with recorders. One of them asked, Lieutenant Colonel, would you like to make a statement? Delaney Price replied on her behalf, There will be no formal statement. My client did not seek publicity. We only sought the truth and acknowledgement. Catherine offered a faint smile. She pulled out her phone and saw a new notification. Case closed. Judgment in favor. Records filed into the system. She quietly placed her phone in her coat pocket and turned away, walking down the stone steps the same way she had walked in, calm, steady, needing no audience. A week later, back at Fort Campbell, Lieutenant Colonel Morrison resumed her duties as usual. There was no special meeting, no commendation. She arrived early, checked logistics records, exchanged brief conversations with her subordinate commanders as if nothing had happened. But everyone knew. From the newest privates to the captains who had served beside her, each understood that something had shifted. Not Catherine, but how people understood her silence. On Monday morning, during an orientation session for new recruits at the training center, Lieutenant Colonel Morrison was invited to give a brief talk on leadership and responsibility. She stepped onto a small wooden podium, looking out at nearly 70 young faces, many of them just 19 or 20. They had never been to combat, never held a rifle in harsh conditions, and never faced a moment where they had to choose between staying silent or speaking up. Catherine began slowly. How many of you believe that wearing a uniform automatically earns you respect? Several hands went up. Some hesitated, others were firm. She nodded. I understand. I used to believe that too. But over more than 20 years of service, I've learned this. Respect doesn't come from your rank. It comes from how you act, especially when no one's watching. The room grew still. She continued, Position, insignia, even the uniform, they're just symbols. What truly defines who you are is the character you display when no symbol is left to shield you. She paused, her gaze drifting to the back row, where a young private was listening intently. Last week, I stood in a courtroom. Not to cry injustice, not to win. I stood there to remind the system that power is not protected by silence, and that power never exempts you from responsibility. As Catherine stepped down from the podium, no loud applause followed. But the eyes of the young people in that room gleamed. Something had been planted. A lesson not found in any handbook, but in the lived truth of the commander standing before them. This story did not end with a news broadcast or a viral headline. It ended with a nod from a woman who refused to bow to injustice and began with a quiet shift within a system that had long remained closed. Lieutenant Colonel Catherine Morrison didn't need fanfare. She only needed justice to be honored, and sometimes that begins with a phone turned on at the right moment, a calm voice, and a woman brave enough to say, I will not stay silent. And so, the story of Lieutenant Colonel Catherine Morrison comes to a close knot with outrage, not with grand declarations, but with the steady resolve of a woman who knows the value of truth and dignity. Thank you for staying with us to the end of this story. If this story resonated with you, if you believe that power must be paired with accountability and that silence is not the answer to injustice, please leave a comment. Share this video with those who need to hear it. And subscribe to our channel so we can continue sharing stories of quiet courage, integrity, and real-life resilience. See you on the next journey, because justice should never live only on paper.